The Game Boy version of WWF Warzone is something that I was really surprised to find out even existed. I'm not expecting this to be anywhere near as good as the PS1 or the N64 versions of the game. I'm just hoping that it's going to be entertaining. Or at the very least playable. That's really all I'm hoping for. This game was released in 1998, and that was very late in the Game Boy's life cycle, and the developers had a lot that they could do with it, just because people knew how to program games for the Game Boy at that point. But yeah, they're facing an uphill battle with this one. Just like the other versions of Warzone, there's no story for this. You're just kind of dropped in, and it's more of an arcade experience than anything else. It's not really a simulation, but there were elements of that, at least on the PS1 and the N64. With this, everything I liked about the PS1 version and the N64 version, they're gone. They're just completely eliminated from the game. And yeah, we get something that just isn't very good. The developers did a great job of getting a lot into the game, but what is here is just not something that I would want to play. The gameplay is very rough. Even with the manual, I was kind of struggling to just do anything. I even changed Game Boys to make sure I was doing stuff right, and just to check if it was, the controller for my Retron 5 to see if that was broke, or any of the controllers I had attached to it. Nothing really changed. It's just a really rough port with a very high learning curve. The game has 4 game modes, which is pretty good for a Game Boy game. The developers did at least do a good job of getting stuff into this, but yeah, the game really falls apart when you try to play it because the controls are just not very responsive. The manual is available online, so you can find all the moves that you, in theory, can do, and you can read about how they're supposed to be done. Actually doing them in the game is pretty rough. I could not get the timing down at all, so that was just probably my own fault on this. It's just not a game that I was into, and not a game that I thought had very good gameplay. Most of it because of the steep learning curve and me just really being terrible at this one. Like, considerably worse than any of the other wrestling games I've played. At the time that I'm recording this, WWF Warzone is the best looking wrestling game on the Game Boy that I've played. It looks very good for its time, and I think a lot of the changes that were necessary to make from the console to the handheld worked out really well. It's definitely not a bad looking game at all. It's pretty good. The digitized photos of the wrestlers, those are not great at all, but they never are on the Game Boy. They just never look very good. Thankfully, the in-game sprites look pretty great. They are kind of based off of each other, so you do have that. You're not going to see a lot of body type changes or anything, but at least they all look pretty good for what they are. The animations look pretty good. The ring looks really nice. The crowd looks decent for a Game Boy game. Everything in here looks good for a handheld console. That's probably the best way I can put it. There's nothing that looks terrible, nothing really looks off. There's stuff that you might say, well, that could be better, but again, it's a regular Game Boy game. This wasn't made for the Game Boy Color, and it was way too early for the Game Boy Advance. So, yeah, it doesn't look as good as one of those games would. It still looks pretty good for a black and white Game Boy game, though. This version of WWF Warzone looks pretty good, but the gameplay just was horrible. I really did not like that at all. The changes that they made didn't ruin the game, but they really messed up the gameplay quite a bit. This is one of those things where if you didn't have access to the console versions, then you might have had the time to figure everything out. But man, I would rather not play this one ever again. I would rather go back and play any of the console versions of really any of the games rather than playing this. I really think the controls just ruined this game. This is not unplayable, but it's fairly close to it, and it just kind of reminds me of the WCW Nitro version on the N64. It's not as bad as that, but it is very disappointing, especially for probably the only person that likes WWF Warzone. I would have expected more from this, or at least turn it into more of an arcade game, instead of trying to really replicate everything from the console ports. So that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.